Hello everyone, today I will talk about how to write the methodology sections. There are two general structures of the methodology that I will talk about. One is the overview or the overall workflow. Another one is the algorithm parts. So let's look at an examples of the overview or the overall workflow. You can see in this example here, we start with the figure, that is figure 3 presents the overall workflow, and then we point to the main pictures of the paper. So this is the key pictures of the papers. So we use this structures that is similar to describing a table in the evaluation. If you still remember, in the evaluation when we are describing the table, we use something like table illustrates, table shows, represents, list presents. Here we basically use figure, we can use figure, something shows or presents the overall workflow of our algorithms. And then after that, we start with the sentence that it says that these two drugs, we can use actually two kinds of way to describe this. Sometimes I use our approach consists of several steps, or the tooth name itself consists of several steps, and the list the steps here, or list the components here. And then we go to the structures that are oftentimes used, that is given something A and B, and then we say it produce or something like or generate C. So this specify clearly what is the input and the output of the approach or the tool. So this is the structures that I oftentimes use. And then later on, I move on to say there are generally two steps or two-phase approach. We use a two-phase approach. We use several steps. We generate something using several steps, several phases. In the first steps, or you can say first it did something, and then second, or in the second steps. Note that we have used some symbol here in this given sentence. That is, we say given a buggy APK P as a subscript P. Here we use this symbol because we are likely to refer to these frequently mentioned components later in the paragraph. So we use this to represent, for example, if you have buggy app, you have version app 1, version app 2, you can use things like P and P prime is oftentimes used to mention several versions of the programs, P, P prime, P double prime. To mention this, you can also use P and P1, P2, P3 to talk about different versions as well. Note that when you use these symbols, you will need to make sure that you surround the entire things that you want it to be subscripts in braces. If you do not do this, if you just do something like app buggy, this will be mistakes because only B will be the subscripts here. Then you will not get things like the entire origins being in the bottom part. So in this case, we define this APKP because we are going to use this always in after the sentence. We compile this APKP. So in this case, we know precisely later on that we are referring to the input APKP. So symbols is oftentimes very important. There is another structure that I always like to use for things that are repeated, or if you have several items. Like for example, you can see here that for each operators, because we have a set of operators, so we start to describe for each operator we are doing what kind of things here. So we have for each as a structures, and then we mention what we are doing with this for each element in this list. So after writing these parts, each of these overview sections follow this particular structures. The only things difference that I would like to mention is that it's important to use active voice here. Example being like log analyzer, we say particularly log analyzer parse the log. If you use passive voice, it will be the log is parsed and extracted, but you will not know which components in your approach is doing this. So same goes with Newton generator because we specify which components in this entire figure that is doing particular things. So importance to use active voice. Now we finished the first kind of structures, that is the overall workflow. So we are describing the overall workflows using this way. And the other kind of important parts of the methodologies is something like an algorithm. So let's look at another examples. Here usually you will have something like an algorithms with a lot of lines. So it's important to label this line with line numbers. So in this case, we are using another structures. First, we are describing actually some challenge. In this examples, let's look at this example. Here we say that traditional approach will usually perform this kind of actions. That here we say that existing approach typically rely on unit tests. But then there is some challenge with these domains, particular on Android apps. So we introduce new challenge, and then we use again the structures one to we basically trying to list the challenge. So we can start an algorithms with the challenge to describe why we need to introduce new approach because of this field challenge. And this challenge is good to always add some citations, need to add some citations for existing works to say what they typically do. And then after that, we also say things like we support several kinds of events, including, and then we use again the structures 1, 2, and 3. We can say we support three types of events 1, 2, and 3. For a particular kind of tool or name like this kind of exception name, I usually use this text TT here because we will want to highlight this. There are not regular English words, so find view by ID with this special fonts will look very obvious that this is not regular English words, so that reviewer will not mistakenly think that this is some misspelled words. So we also important that if you want to use this particular tool or a programs or a library, you know the capitalizations being correct. Like for example, GitHub have this capital letter G and then ish as a capital letter as well. So you will need to get the correct capitalizations. If you couldn't get the correct capitalizations, or if you oftentimes need to repeat um, this kind of categorizations, I would suggest that you will try to use something like a macro. So here I show some examples of a macro here. So we can look at these macros that I oftentimes use certain phrase that is very long. So we can use new commands and then first and then use a macro to represent something that you oftentimes need to write but very long, or it has some capitalizations, for example like GitHub's, that is uh, easy to get it incorrect because sometimes you may forget to capitalize H, for example. So you can use macro to actually help you with this kind of tooth name. And then after that, we use this also structures that say use several strategies, and then we goes into saying specifically for each UI test. So this is again very similar structures with the previous parts where we say we use several steps. In the first steps, we can change this a little bit and say use several strategy specifically, and then we mention the specific strategy. So this is also another structures that we can use here. Another things that we will look at when we are looking into algorithm like this line by line is that we can actually first, of course, we are going to mention this algorithm one shows this key, and then we again can use the same structure. Given something, it outputs something, and then I want to show you guys that for a particular line range, you usually have this parenthesis. So you're trying to mention what happens in one block of codes. So one block of codes, and then you have such things like lines one dash dash two. Note that you need two dash here to denote a range. For just single dash will just give you things like is not correct because we need a range here for lines, and we also trying to use two kinds of structure here when we are writing the algorithm. Basically, we usually write this uh, after that, and then after processing this on line 29. So this is trying to tie or connect the sentence, this output of this lines to this particular lines. Here we have make a mistake, it should be lines 30 to 31, for example. So we basically label this parts, this entire parts about what it's doing, so using the text. And then we also trying to mention this whole block 32 to 34 um, in this sentence, like this kind of structure in lines 12 to 13, what is doing. And then we use these structures is very similar to regular kind of way the dimensions if and else statements, or if is doing something. I will not recommend you writing else particularly because it's not formal. So if you want to do else in the English sentence, it should be otherwise. It should be spelled or out rather than using else, because it's too informal if you just use else. So that's all for the algorithm sections. I will describe about how to write other sections in my other video.